everybody. My name is Micah Ramsey. I'm the pastor at Eastvale RP Church. Someone messaged me recently asking a question about judging or judging others. There's a popular misconception that we are not to judge. Now, people will quickly say, Jesus specifically said, do not judge, which would make it look as if anybody who does judge is doing something wrong, something completely contrary to what Jesus has said. Now, whenever we're considering any commandment in Scripture, it's important for us to go and to look at specifically what was said and the context all around it. Now, before we do that, let's define our term. If we're talking about judging, what do we mean? Now, I would say judging boils down to a critique, where we're discerning between right and wrong. I don't know that you can go any differently than that in between discerning between what is right and wrong. So if Jesus was speaking to us and he was saying, you shall not judge, he would be saying, you can't decide between what's right and what's wrong. You're not in that position. Now, is there any truth to that? There is the truth that we don't have an eternal perspective. We don't see how things are going to unfold or how they're going to play out. We can truly be doing something that we think is right and later on see that it had some really negative consequences. But if Jesus was speaking to us and he was telling us something different than that, how would we find out? Well, we can look at the scripture together. Let's look at the context of what Jesus was saying. If we look in Matthew chapter 7, we see that famous passage, you shall not judge. That's chapter 7. All right, here we have Matthew chapter 7. Right off, it says immediately, do not judge so that you will not be judged. Now let's go back and look at the broader context of what's going on here. We can fly back and we can see that Matthew chapter 7 is in the section of scripture called the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is teaching. If we move forward to verses 17 through 19, we see Jesus gives us some specific instructions. He says, do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass away from the law until all has been accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. If we continued on looking at what Christ has said, we see in verse 21, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. We could continue down and see some specific instruction, starting in verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So we see Jesus affirming the law and everything that he has said. We move to the next page and look at verses 31 through 32. Here Jesus gives specific instructions condemning divorce. Now we move forward to where we had once begun, and Jesus makes the statement, do not judge so that you will not be judged. So what is the question here? The question here is, how can we say don't discern between right and wrong when Jesus has just warned us that we are to keep the law, that we are to do what he has said? Well, As we looked at the earlier context, let's look at the rest of the context from this passage. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Now, Jesus begins using a picture for us. Now, this picture that we have is someone who has a problem. In fact, two people that have a problem. They have something in their eye, as he describes it. He asks, starting in verse 3, why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, there is a log in your own eye? And here we come to the issue that Jesus is actually addressing. You hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So Jesus isn't saying, as some people suppose, you're never to discern between right and wrong. He's saying, do discern between right and wrong, and start with your own face. Start with your own problem. Don't be a hypocrite. Take the log out of your eye. Deal with your own significant sin, and then don't condemn other people, but help other people. Help them to deal with their issues, because the reality is sin hurts. Consider the sins that Jesus had just addressed in chapter 5. If we look at the anger that we would hold in our hearts, if we looked at the consequences of adultery, we look at the consequences of lust, we look at the consequences of divorce. It all hurts. Jesus is telling us, deal with it. Jesus blesses us with an explanation of the law, what it really looks like. We look at this section and we see it really boiled down to the heart issues. Later on, the apostles were put into the place to explain everything that Jesus has said to us. If you looked at the book of Romans, for example, you would find in the book of Romans a great systematic theology, an explanation of everything. Next, boiled down, we have a more boiled down theology in the book of Galatians. Here in Galatians chapter 6, we have a restatement and a great explanation of this passage. Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. So to say Jesus has said, do not judge, is to really take Christ out of context. It's to throw out the whole truth that there is eternal truth. God has expressed eternal truth. He's expressed eternal truth in the scripture, and this is boiled down to love, what it really means to love, what it really means to love God, what it really means to love our neighbor. After all, if you love someone, you don't want them running around with a sharp pair of scissors. Sin is exactly that. It is this thing that will harm us, it will harm others, it will harm everybody that cares about us. So Jesus says, deal with the log that's in your eye, and look at other people and help them. Bear their burdens with a spirit of gentleness and help them to be recovered. So do discern between right and wrong, and do love God by loving him and keeping his commands. Do love your neighbor by caring for them and supporting them and bringing them to a closer walk with Jesus Christ. I'm Micah, and this is the Scriptures teaching on judging.